I'm Lexie Smyth. I'm the fiction category manager here at Barnes & Noble. Thank you all so much for joining us today for our virtual book club event celebrating Liz Moore's The God of the Woods. Just a few housekeeping notes. If you've submitted questions through the Eventbrite, we have them. But if you haven't and you have one that you would like to submit, please feel free to do so using the Q&A module in Zoom. Most importantly, this is a conversation where there will be spoilers. If you haven't finished the book yet and don't want to hear spoilers, we will share this discussion later on YouTube, and you can join us there when you finish the book. Now that that's out of the way, I'm really excited to introduce today's guests. My conversation partner is Kiley Reid, the author of 2 New York Times bestsellers, Such a Fun Age, which was a Reese's Book Club pick and longlisted for the Booker Prize, and most recently, Come and Get It, which was a Good Morning America Book Club pick. Kiley, I'm so thrilled you could join me today.
Thanks, Lexie.
Liz Moore is the author of the New York Times bestselling novel Long Bright River, which was a Good Morning America Book Club pick and one of Barack Obama's favorite books of 2019, as well as the acclaimed novels Heft and The Unseen World, and of course, the book that's been thrilling readers all summer long, The God of the Woods.
Hi.
Kiley, I know why I love this book so much, but I'd love to kick us off by having you talk a little bit about what you love about this book.
Sure. There was so much I loved about this book, and this was the kind of book that if I was still teaching, that I would put into a class about structure and multiple POVs. But honestly, okay, if I was teaching my dream class, it would be something about the nuance of wealth in literature. I feel like this family, this looming camp owner family, has such a specific type of culture and breed that just seeps into everything, even the people who don't have money who are attending this camp. And so that was something that was really enjoyable for me to see the ripple effects of decisions made that are like the underbelly is like wealth and power and maintaining that. So that was one of the things I really loved about this book. But also, I just didn't see the ending coming. So that's always nice to do that, but also to not just be reading for the ending as well. This was never in the crossword puzzle. Oh, I finished it. I know the ending realm. It was just soaking up every minute of being in the woods with this family. So I could go on and on, but I'll stop there. Yeah.
Well, you set me up really well for the first question I have for Liz, which is really that the structure of this book is so incredibly engaging. Not only do we get the story from multiple points of view, but it also moves back and forth through time. I'm curious, Liz, if you always knew it would be told that way, and if you could talk a little bit about your writing process and how you plotted all of this out.
Sure. Yeah. First of all, thank you for having me, Barnes and Noble and Lexie, and hi, Kiley. It's really good to see you on Zoom. And I also want to say hi to everybody in the audience. Thank you for reading it or being almost done reading it. And yeah, so the structure of the book or the multiple points of view, every time I set out to write a book, I think that it will be my kind of like simple and straightforward book, and it never is so far. For whatever reason, I tend to gravitate toward multiple timelines. In Long Bright River, for example, there was the present day narrative, and then there was the past, and the past took place over about 20 years. I think it's my inclination to show rather than tell, and to me, showing includes a lot of scene work, and therefore my books tend to get long and complicated. The way that I kept track of it was just sort of simultaneously. I never outline in advance. I never pre-plan anything, but I do keep a kind of like running log of every date that I name, every place that I name, every character and their birth date and death date, if there is one. So that if I quickly have to figure out like, okay, how old was Alice when Bear disappeared? I have my running chronology and I can consult that so that I'm not constantly doing math problems in my head. But that's about it. That's the only thing I do in terms of keeping track of stuff.
It's impressive.
I'm so impressed by that. There was so much going on that the whole time I was like, how did she keep track of all of this?
Microsoft.
Speaking of the multiple perspectives, whose perspective came to you first, and how did you land on whose perspectives would tell the story?
So I wrote a short story over a decade before I think I sold the manuscript even for The God of the Woods, and it was called Shy Shy, and it was in Tin House, which is now a defunct magazine, sadly. And it was set at a summer camp. That was written in the second person, and it was also it was contemporary, so it didn't have any kind of like historical fiction element to it. But there was one character with a different name who reminded me a lot, who was the inspiration, let's say, for the character of Tracy, the outsider character who comes into camp, whom Barbara befriends, and who ends up becoming an important source of information as the investigation proceeds. So, in one way, the character of Tracy predates the novel. In another way, Louise, the counselor, was the first close third person point of view that arrived to me. So the opening sentence of the book, the opening chapter of the book was always the opening chapter of the book. There was a brief aberration where I played with writing it in a more chronological way, and then I said no. So Louise was always like front and center in the book.
I think that's a nice trick too in a book like this where you're not sure who to trust, like giving the reader a trustworthy, like responsible counselor in the very beginning to ground you a bit before you start not trusting other people, I think is a really good move.
Thank you. And it's funny because I read Come and Get It when I think, no, I read it in advance because I ended up loving it and giving it a quote. But whenever I read it, I realized that there are kind of like certain thematic similarities between the two, which isn't surprising because Kiley and I are friends and we get along. But I think of the character of Millie as another kind of like responsible figure in charge of people she is contemporaries with, just a few years older than, but the weight of not coming from money, not having many resources, and being tasked with overseeing, in some cases, children who do,
Right.
late teenagers who do. That struck me as kind of like an interesting, cool coincidence.
Yeah, we always
Safety.
Liz and I always end up having these very weird similar things in our books. Like a child throwing up at a party was our one in our last
Yes,
one. Yeah,
that's right. And now we both have children.
exactly. Yeah, but I think
Yeah.
that responsible character is so interesting and sometimes difficult because you can bend into like perfect character syndrome for someone. And
Yeah.
I think that you don't trust people who are that perfect all the time, but everyone here is very flawed and a little bit sneaky in a very campy way, which I think worked out very nicely. Yeah.
Thanks.
Question I have for both of you about your most recent books. Did you know going into writing those books that you would be writing about class and wealth and money, or how did that theme sort of develop in each of the books?
You go first, Kiley.
How did I know? Oh, see, I feel like that's just where okay. I feel like the books that I want to read are mostly about the world that we live in today. And I definitely view the world through a bit of a survivalist, materialist lens. Like even in my own dreams, when I'm sleeping, I'm like, oh, maybe I'm doing this. And I find out, I'm like, oh, this is amazing. And I think, oh, but how would I pay for that? Oh, but where would I park? Oh, how would I do this? I think that my brain just goes towards the logistics of a situation, and logistics are money. And so I love watching characters grapple with the same things that real people do. I love watching normal people who have normal jobs. And I like it when an author can make me see the extraordinary moments within those very normal places. And so I never set out to write about class and money right away. I think that that's actually a bad idea to go in saying, I'm going to prove a point about this. I have to get obsessed with who that one person is and their relationship to money and power and struggles. And so I think it honestly just kind of comes out a little bit. But when I look back at like terrible short stories that I wrote when I was in sixth grade, they all bend towards the limitations that the world puts on us. I don't write sci-fi, but I like the world building in those big books the same way that I like the limitations that money puts on characters in contemporary novels as well.
Yeah, I think I too resist the urge, or I don't even have the urge really to write about a particular theme, but the same themes keep coming up over and over again in my books. Themes like found family or sort of like created communities, strangers coming together and forming a community. And yes, wealth and class is a theme that comes up over and over again. I think, it's something I've been interested in since childhood. Also, the ways that one can perceive one's own place in the world and how that can be altered by one's surroundings. So I grew up middle class in a working class town, thinking of myself as like, a person, thinking of my family as a family with like means because we were growing up in a working class town. And then moving to New York City and attending a private college and realizing, oh no, like this is what wealth is. This is what capital is. These are the children of people who are like governing not just the country, but the world. Like, and that's that being in proximity to people of different social classes creates a lot of natural narrative tension, which is something that's always convenient too for writers of fiction. Anytime you can like just throw people together and watch them clash due to where they come from, I think it's sort of like it's almost a convenience really from a story standpoint.
I think a camp is a perfect place for that. That's probably why I write about work so often, is because you have so many different people from different backgrounds coming into one place.
Mm-hmm.
And some people at that camp need that job, like
Mm-hmm.
one of the counselors in the beginning, and some people just do it for fun and they all just have to deal with each other and what all the values that they're bringing from home. Yeah, I
Yeah,
agree.
absolutely.
You both also really write interesting young people. Barbara and Tracy were two of the most interesting characters in the book to me. And Kiley, in Come and Get It, all of the various women who lived in the dorm, all of their different voices were fascinating. Can you talk a little bit about what it's like to write from that much younger perspective?
Sure. Everyone is different. I do a ton of research for my books, and I interviewed probably 15 different young people, and that was huge in terms of developing the voices for my characters. So I was in graduate school at the iWriters Workshop, and I knew that I had this like plethora of young people like at my disposal, and I didn't want to lose it yet, even though I didn't know what I was going to be writing. So I had interviews, much like the professor does at the beginning of my book, with students, asking them what words like trashy and classy and sleazy mean, and the answers were really inspirational to me. I don't think that you have to do that research, but dialogue is such a huge part of my enjoyment when I'm reading a book. When someone says something perfectly familiar, it makes me have to kind of close a book a little bit, and that's what I'm aiming for. The characters here, Barbara and Tracy specifically, I feel that I don't know how Liz did this, but they sound like they are from a different time period, which they are. And I would love to hear more about that too. Like they do not sound like contemporary people. And I think that that's a hard thing to nail. They never once sounded any kind of 2000s. And yeah, I'm curious about Liz's process too.
Great question. So I was not alive in the 70s. I was born in the early 80s. I do feel as if, so I have a lot of like family history and family still in the Adirondacks. And to me, it feels a little bit like a place out of time. So I just assumed that some of my earliest memories from the 80s wouldn't have been that far removed from what was going on in 1975 in the Adirondacks, or even potentially 1961. Um, but yeah, I think dialogue is something that it was not my earliest let's say gift as a writer. It's something that I've had to work on as a writer over the years. And I imagine, but maybe this is a false assumption, that for Kiley, it was one of the things that you were always really good at, just because you're so good at it now. Knowing Kiley in person, it's like you have a very like, you're a parrot. Like you can hear the way that somebody talks and do an impression, or hear the way that somebody talks, and most importantly for your career, write it down in that way. And also in a way that you can really hear it on as it's on the page. You can really hear it as it would be spoken aloud. And yes, every now and then when I'm reading your work, I come across a phrase where I'm like, I know exactly who this person is from this line of dialogue. I think my own dialogue is a little bit more just sort of like functional. I tend to spend a lot more time in scene and exposition, and I use dialogue like, if I must, always a little bit tentatively. I'm kind of like, I guess I'm critical of myself when it comes to dialogue.
This is funny that you use the word functional, though, because I was actually talking to another writer and friend of both of ours, Megan Angelo, who also
Mhm.
just finished and loved your book too. And we both talk about how difficult it is to even just get two characters into a room. It
Mhm.
takes, you're like, oh, I'm going to do the dinner scene today. And then all day you're just working on getting them into the house, and it's very
Yeah.
frustrating. And for her, your book was this like example of like, it is okay to use the sparseness of dialogue within your prose as well. She's like, Liz just tells you. And I'm like, oh, that's beautiful. Okay, now I'm ready. There's just like a functionality to your writing that gets you into the good parts. Like you don't waste time, getting everyone in the door. You are there immediately. And so I think that that works with your dialogue as well. I do think you use more negative space, particularly with Barbara, who's just really cool in her dialogue. And everything that is really interesting what she's saying is also what she's holding back. So I'll give yourself some credit there.
Yeah, I've started screenwriting a little bit, and both of us do. And I've noticed that, like, for being a writer of fiction, my inclination is always to use dialogue that is so spare and to rely on the visual when I am in screenwriting mode, and like let actions speak louder than words. And I'm almost afraid to give too many words to my characters, which is funny, and it probably a reflection of how I feel about dialogue in general.
One of the things that really struck me about the book is that many of the women whose perspectives we get are incredibly observant of the people around them in different ways, but Tracy, Louise, and of course, Judy, they're all very observations. They all make these great observations. One of my favorites is when Judy notes that rich people become the most enraged when they're about to be held accountable for their behavior. And I'm curious if you intended for these characters to share this trait.
Yeah, I mean, I think. Uh, do you mean the trait of being skeptical of the rich, or just being observant of human behavior in a general sense?
A little bit of both.
Okay. Yeah, I, like many writers, spent a lot of my childhood like just observing the behavior of others in a kind of like anthropological way, also by virtue because of the fact that I was very, very, very shy as a kid and not socially skillful. And so I remember, literally like writing down things that I could say in advance of a social setting so that I would come prepared, which of course probably resulted in like completely stilted, horrible conversations. But, being perceiving oneself to be an outsider socially lets one observe others in a way that does probably hone a particular writing skill later on, or early on, so that you can use it later as a writer. Um, and yeah, a lot of my characters, I guess, reflect that tendency as well, whether it's Tracy or Judy, as you say, uh, who have big thoughts that they're not necessarily allowed to say aloud, especially because they are in two different ways not power holders in society.
What was also interesting to me too is that while Louise was so observant of the world around her, she was caught off guard by John Paul betraying her, pinning the disappearance of Barbara on her. And I'd love to hear you talk about how you made that choice to have that happen and why you think Louise wasn't able to see that coming.
I think she was. I also am I obsessively write characters who are in denial and like know something to be true and resist knowing it. So in Long Bright River, my first person narrator just basically like was in denial about every single facet of her life, and misled the reader, but I think only because she was really misleading herself about her complicity in various things. And I think there are many characters in this book who are functioning in a similar way. Alice, most obviously, is a lot like the Mickey character in Long Bright River, where she's part of this system that is not good, but she doesn't know how to get out of it. But yes, also Louise wants so badly to achieve a better life for her brother, is like the simplistic way of looking at it, but probably also a better life for herself. She's frankly probably just tired of doing the kind of physical labor or working in service the way that she is, and she can imagine a more comfortable life for herself and her brother, and she's willfully overlooking some pretty big red flags in her boyfriend. Um, which is also just to say, you know, this is what we were talking about at the start of the conversation. Those without means sometimes are forced to compromise their own safety and like the, you know, emotional and physical safety. And I think that's the position that Louise is in too.
That's how I read Louise there, that whether she knows it or not, she's trying to protect herself,
Mhm.
like by staying close to this family for as long as possible. I think when
Yeah.
you're in a situation like that, sometimes you can't see that, like, you know, there are also other camps and other men that you could align yourself with. But in the moment, you're so afraid to give up this like source of stability, especially when you have somebody else that you're trying to protect. Yeah,
It's the sunk cost theory.
that's the one. Yeah, I couldn't think of the word. Yeah.
Yeah.
There was a fair amount of that I found in the book. Even though it's partially set in the 70s, many of the female characters all kind of existed within these limiting confines. There was something that they kept bumping up against. And I'd love to hear a little bit more from you about how that helps drive the plot of the novel.
Yeah. I mean, I can't remember who said it, but the idea of that narrative tension is created by not only, you know, shutting and locking the doors in the room, but shutting and locking all the windows is, I think about that a lot when writing. If characters have any way out, like then they would take it. So you have to keep shutting doors and windows until they're forced to do something that either goes against their ethics, which I think a lot of characters do in The God of the Woods and in a lot of my other books as well. Or they refuse to do something that goes against their ethics, and they're kind of like punished in one way or another for it.
Can we talk a little bit about TJ and
Yeah.
how you developed that character? Because she truly fascinated me from start to finish. I never felt like I fully got a read on who she was. So I would just love to hear a little bit more about your process of writing TJ.
Yeah, TJ is another person in the novel who does not conform to expectations of her, either in the way that she expresses her gender identity or her sexuality. She's in also very close proximity to the Van Laars, who prize kind of like traditional gender expression above all else, practically. The way that Alice looks at her own daughter is with like real disgust because of the way that she's chosen to express herself sartorially, and also in terms of like not appearing ladylike enough. And so Alice, I think, harbors like a similar disdain for TJ, but also understands that the Hewitt family and the Van Laar family have this kind of like connection between them that Alice can't quite grasp. Like she understands that the Hewitts are protected by the Van Laars. She doesn't quite know why. Of course, later we find out that it's because the Hewitts are keeping a big secret alongside the Van Laars, and that's the ethical compromise that they've made. Um, so I think TJ is like the keeper of this secret, but also very, very aware that her family did the wrong thing at one point and is trying to correct that decision in various ways. First of all, by caring for Barbara in the way that that Barbara's parents aren't caring for her, and also in the way I think TJ, even though she was only 4 years older than Bear, feels in some way the response, like that she could have protected him, or you know, she could have done something for him in a way that she didn't. I don't think she's right about that, but I think that's her emotional landscape. And so she has this kind of silent vow to protect Barbara, because she couldn't protect Bear. One of the reasons I think, I don't know, but I wonder if one of the reasons that TJ seems opaque is because TJ doesn't get a close third person POV the way that a lot of the other characters in the book do, which is a regret of mine, actually, because I think TJ is really interesting and I would have loved to give her a close third point of view, but if I had, there would have been no mystery. So
Yeah.
TJ is the secret keeper for a lot of different things in the novel. And she needed to come under suspicion at a certain point, and she needed to, not show her whole hand. And so she had to function as this kind of like mysterious figure in the distance in order to preserve the mystery of the book.
As you're writing TJ, but not from a close third, I'm so curious if TJ obviously cared very, very much for Bear. Sometimes we also do the right thing for the wrong reason. Was that ever something that you saw behind TJ in her actions to help one of the other Van Lars? Was it always in her? I mean, she's a human, so probably not like always cut and dry. Was it always like this person needs help, or I'm gonna stick it to him a little bit?
Yeah, I absolutely. That's funny that you say that. I think there is a little bit like they really TJ, because I guess Barbara at just 13, we can't necessarily hold to the same account. But TJ goes like above and beyond what she needs to do. Like John Paul sucks as a person, and he is abusive to Louise, and he is engaging in a sexual relationship with somebody a lot younger than him, Annabelle, not Barbara, as it turns out. And he's just a dick. Can I say that? He's not a good guy. But he is not the person who framed Carl Stoddard all those years ago. His family was complicit in that. So in a way, the idea that TJ actively tries to frame John Paul for the abduction and or murder of Barbara is even a step beyond what she needs to do.
Yeah.
And so I do think there's a kind of like vengeful quality to her as well that renders her hopefully less than too saint-like. Like I think TJ's messed up too, just like a lot of the other characters in the book.
Yeah.
So speaking of the Van Lars, I was obsessed with the way they were obsessed with Emerson. And I thought it was really fascinating how the story they told Alice and Delphine about how they built self-reliance was so different from what the driver told Alice and Delphine. And I would love for you to just talk a bit about that, talk about writing these people, what it was like to research them, to write about the way wealthy people sometimes perceive themselves and how other people perceive them, because I thought it was just fascinating.
Yeah, I think there is a myth of self-creation that a lot of generationally wealthy families have, that implies that they are, special or more deserving of the wealth that they've accrued. They are more deserving of that wealth than others are. And I think the Van Lars are very much fall into that category. At one point, I think it's Louise, I've actually forgotten, who thinks about the idea that too much wealth over too many generations sort of like poisons the gene pool. And that's a theme that is coming up a lot right now, in pop culture. For example, like Succession, I think plays with the same theme. I think Kiley plays a lot with the idea of like what wealth does to the inheritors of wealth, even more than the first generation to acquire wealth. But yeah, I think that basically, the Van Lars telling of events has them as the people who pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. The local community, in the local community's telling of the same events, it's really the local community who built the house that the Van Lars now occupy, that staff the grounds, that mow the lawn, that that run the kitchen. And so the idea that the cherry on top is that the family named their house Self-Reliance, the house that they did not build. And the original title for the book was actually Self-Reliance, which I've said publicly many times now. But it felt a little bit, the risk, I think, of that title was that people would think it was a self-help book. And so we eventually came to a different title.
We're getting a lot of questions in the chat about Alice and Delphine. Can you talk a little bit about the two of them and their relationship?
Yeah, I think Delphine is a weird character. Delphine is Alice's sister. She is, in a good way, I think she defies a lot of the expectations placed upon her by society because she's a woman who prioritizes education, who thinks freely, um, who has a relatively progressive vision of what marriage can be between a man and a woman. I think she genuinely had respect for and loved her late husband. And yet she also falls into the same trap that the Van Laars fall into, which is to think of her younger sister as somebody a little bit dim and like, unworldly. And I genuinely believe that Delphine like thinks that Alice can't be hurt or something. Like Alice is a pawn for both her own family and for the Van Laars. And um Alice doesn't see herself as very bright, and I think those around her also don't see her as very bright. But to be fair to Alice, she's also never really given much encouragement to seek out education. And so I think Delphine is a really, really free thinker, but potentially just a narcissist, who doesn't really consider the feelings of her younger sister in a lot of her decisions.
From the moment that they meet the whole Van Laar family, there was something about Delphine like almost presenting Alice as if it was like a cotillion or something, and Delphine was her dad, being like,
Yeah.
here's the goods a little bit. And I feel like
Yeah.
that stuck around for a bit.
I think in the 50s, like Alice, she was the goods. She was the it was effectively like an arranged marriage. And that was that for Alice.
Yeah.
She doesn't become a good person from it, though. She's not a nice lady eventually.
So we are slowing down. We're starting to run out of some time. So I do want to get to talking about the ending of the book because it absolutely blew me away. I would love to know if you always knew how it was going to end, or if you wrote your way to that ending. If you can talk a little bit about your process there.
I did not always know how the book would end. Generally, the only things I know going into a book are the place it is set, the most important characters, the main characters, and the first problem that they face, the kind of like inciting incident. So I knew going in that this would be my book set in the Adirondacks, specifically at a summer camp, with a kind of mansion on its grounds. I knew that the Van Laars would be the people populating the mansion, and I knew that Louise would be a character overseeing their daughter's cabin, and that the inciting incident would be their daughter goes missing. Everything else came later in the writing, including the idea that there would be a double mystery, like the idea that Bear had disappeared 14 years earlier. That came in the writing. I resisted that urge actually for a long time because I knew it would make the book a lot more complex and longer, but I eventually gave into it. The ending, I thought, I didn't even know, well, while I was entering the book, whether Bear would be dead or alive. Like I thought
He
there
would make an appearance. Yeah.
What's that?
I thought he would make an appearance for sure.
Yeah, I played with versions of that. I have like scenes about it that will never see the light of day. The character of Slitter or Jacob Sluter, there were moments where I was like, maybe he did have something to do with one or the other, or maybe he didn't, maybe he did. And it was really, I think it was probably after I figured out what had happened to Bear that I started to think of a way to make Barbara's disappearance a kind of reaction to that event. And metaphorically, it made sense to me that the Hewitts, who had been complicit in covering up the truth about Bear, would be complicit in letting Barbara kind of like escape from the same family that had done such terrible things to the community. So the Hewitts were sort of like the pendulum back and forth. And so it just felt like poetically right to have Barbara make an escape and to be free of her family if Bear was ultimately like a victim of his own family.
Mhm.
But yeah, it wasn't until much later in the writing process, and it required a lot of rewriting over and over and over and over.
I loved the moment when Barbara brought the picture of Bear to the cabin. Um, did she know what happened to her brother? Did TJ tell her?
So I've gotten this question a few times. This is all stuff that happens like off screen, right? So I can only tell you what I imagine, and I imagine that as part of the conversations about what they would do, TJ and Barbara, that a version of the truth of what happened to her brother did come out. I I think for TJ to tell her that truth when she was too young would have put the Hewitts in huge danger, because that would have been a secret that they were very closely guarding also from Barbara. But when Barbara got the news that her family was basically like shipping her away, anyway, my guess is there would be a version like TJ would have told her, yeah, what had happened.
Yeah. I took it as like TJ maybe in private. I imagine TJ saying something along the lines of, if they did this,
Mm-hmm.
then-
Mm-hmm.
and that event has like messed them up so much more.
Yeah.
Like think about like what they might do to you too. So we might want to get you out.
Right. During one of their nighttime survival training sessions between TJ and Barbara, the conversation occurred. Yeah.
I also really loved at the end how, Judy had this theory of what had happened. And she needed to know that her theory was right. But she wasn't going to reveal Barbara's location, even though it would have totally made her career.
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to hear about how that came together for you, how you wrote that all, how you landed on that, because it was fascinating to me.
Yeah, I'm very interested in, I think, character. There's a big difference for me between what is legally right and what is morally right. And I think over time we have seen our conception of what is legally right be proven to be completely false in retrospect. And so I think Judy is making a decision that comes from her gut to prioritize the well-being of another young woman, over this career-making discovery. It's certainly, I think I allowed myself to lean into the fiction of it. I think probably an actual investigator might fear the repercussions of it, but at a certain point, I think when crafting a work of fiction, you do allow yourself to kind of like lean into theme and lean into what am I trying to say about the world more than like how am I technically sticking to the facts of what would actually transpire. So that's the decision that I made.
Well, it was a great decision. It really surprised me and I loved it.
Thank
I
you.
have a question if there's still time.
Yeah.
I would love to know, you've been doing publicity for this book for a long time now, and I'm so curious about the scene that you're like, how has no one brought this up? This was such a special scene to me. What's that scene for you?
Hmm. Um, so I guess when I think back to the question of like putting characters in a room and making them do things, the survival trip was built up in my head with so much dread because I knew it would be like something big had to happen there, but I didn't know what it was. And I was worried that it would be sort of like a boring set piece that went on too long. And it ended up being um, a scene that I liked writing because it was as revealing of like character. There is something that had to happen there, which is that Barbara had to get injured. She had to bleed on her own clothing so that that clothing could be planted. And that's sort of like part of it was a convenient thing that they were able to use. But also the kind of like quartet of kids in the tent when they're playing Truth or Dare, really I just felt a lot of empathy for all four of those children. And it was really important to me to lean away from stereotypes about like popular boys or girls or out like they all there's there they the playing field is very even there between all four of them. Certainly like there are two characters who love other characters who don't love them back in there, but everybody's kind of kind about it. Like it's, it was fun for me to write a scene that I felt that I hoped defied stereotypes about children at that age.
Yeah, I enjoyed it too.
Thanks.
One of the things we received the most questions about was the title and its derivation from the word panic, related to the Greek god Pan, who was the god of the woods. Can you talk a bit about how you landed on that as the title and how that plays into the themes of the book?
Yeah, so when we collectively decided that self-reliance would not be the title of the book, I sort of like went back to the drawing board and had to think about like, okay, what could it possibly be? And there are so many titles that I came up with and rejected.
The tree one. I remember talking to you about.
Yeah, Kiley was in on this conversation. Every writer friend I had and non-writer friend I had was like trying to help me. Because you went through it too, Kiley, right? You had to come up with, it was hard to come up with a title. It is always hard to come up with a title. But eventually I came across this term wood panic, which is the term, a technical term for what happens when you feel very, very disoriented in a forest because all the trees start to look the same and and then I looked up the etymology of the word panic and discovered that it does come from the Greek god Pan, who is said to be like a trickster god who liked to disorient people in the woods. And then I started thinking about, so he's the god of the woods, but then I started to think about like all the other characters who could have that label, including the Van Laars, who I think perceive themselves to be like the gods of their domain in this very self-important way. Slitter, who's kind of like a chaotic force of evil just wandering around in the background. And then ultimately, since this is a spoiler-friendly zone, Barbara is, the guy. She emerges from the trees and in a kind of she looks like a mythological character. It strikes Judy that she's very much like one with nature and seems content in a way that probably Bear didn't ever achieve in his lifetime necessarily. So she's the god of the woods too. There's so many gods of the woods. They're all over the place in this book.
Before we wrap things up, Kiley, do you have any more questions for Liz?
I do. I so selfishly want to ask a few more if that's okay. Well, this one's a little bit personal, I guess. Are there any drawbacks to writing twisted, thrillery, creepy kind of book in a place that you love to visit in your life?
My own family liked to torment us in the Adirondacks with creepy stories, and so it comes very naturally to us. Like, I think part of the beauty of the woods is this sense of danger. One of the epigraphs of the God of the Woods is comes from Woodswoman by the writer Anne LaBastille, who is wonderful, and you should all read the Woodswoman. I think it's a trilogy, but it's a series of memoirs by a woman named an ecologist named Anne LaBastille, who lived on her own in the wilderness of the Adirondacks for a long time. And she writes about how the beauty and the peril of the woods inform each other equally. And that's exactly how I feel when I'm in the Adirondacks. It's like a great sense of respect for my surroundings, the knowledge that nature feels pretty neutral about us. Like we worship nature, but nature is kind of like, I mean, we could take you or leave you. You're part of nature too. Like, and so no, I think the answer is I'm just leaning into my own family's tradition of telling terrifying stories about serial killers and people getting lost, and kind of that like spooky atmosphere also lends to the beauty of the woods to me.
Yeah, I agree. And my last one, I promise, this was actually one that Liz asked me maybe like 3 or 4 years ago, but I always ask people this now. As a writer, I feel very strongly that you get a spark to write a book, and a lot of times that spark does not end up in the book. It and I compare it to, this is so stupid, but there was this very powerful commercial in the 2000s I think it was Kohler or something like that, some like kitchen commercial. And there was this very sexy, chic woman who had a faucet, and she was
Mhm.
like, design me a kitchen around this faucet. And
Mm.
every woman was like, am I gay? Like it was very commercial. But I
Right.
often feel like that faucet is the spark, but by
Yeah.
the end of the kitchen, the faucet, you don't even need it anymore. So I'm curious what that a very tiny initial spark was that got you to the God of the Woods.
I think it was the short story I wrote, Shy Shy. You can probably find it still. You might have to buy the magazine, but that was the first short story I got published in like a major literary magazine, and it was very important to me, and I loved writing it, and it's one of the few short stories I've ever written like practically in one sitting. It just flew out of me. And so returning to it was a pleasure, and yet it's very different. There was no mystery to that story. It was all character. It was a story of an outsider and, teenage politics and that kind of stuff. But that was the spark, and then it was gone.
That was it.
Yeah. And I have the chat open and I haven't looked at it much throughout this whole thing, but can I respond to Brittany Hunt? If you're interested in the influence or presence in the Adirondacks of Indigenous people, read Rural Indigenousness. It is a wonderful nonfiction text about the Algonquin and Iroquois people in the Adirondacks and the way that they use the land, and kind of like myths also about the way they use the land imposed upon them by the Western people who settled there. It's super interesting. And I read it as part of the research for this book.
The question I ask everyone at the end of each of these events is, what, if anything, do you want readers to take away from your book?
I want readers to take away something super specific from this book, which is the technical knowledge that if you do get lost in the woods, you should sit down and yell, because it will save your life. Maybe. But I do have that fantasy that like someday somebody's going to remember those words and not try to extricate themselves from the wilderness, but actually sit down and blow your whistle or yell or something. And you have a much better chance of being found that way.
Isn't there a word for the panic run that you do when you're trying to find when you're doing the exact wrong thing?
Well, I don't know. Is there?
I'll find it, and that can be the
Yeah,
title
yeah.
of the
Fix
next
me.
book, I feel. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Cool.
Well, thank you both so much for joining us today. This was such a fantastic conversation. Kylie, thank you so much for your great questions. As a reminder, if you haven't read God of the Woods or Come and Get It, you can pick up copies of the books at your local Barnes & Noble or online at barnesandnoble.com. And we will be back again next month to discuss our August book club pick. Thank you all again for joining us. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Kylie. This was really fantastic.
Thank you both. And thank you to all of you in the chat and otherwise. Really appreciate your being here.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.